Our words for meditation are from a poem by Emily Dickinson. It's called The Props Assist the House. It's a new one for me. The props assist the house until the house is built, and then the props withdraw, and adequate, erect, the house supports itself and ceases to recollect the augur and the carpenter. Just such a retrospect hath the perfected life, a past of plank and nail and slowness, and then the scaffolds drop, affirming it a soul. Always a happy moment when I pop up out of here and see everyone's faces. The theme for the month for the UUs is nonviolence. At first thought, you'd think that would be an easy swing to hit this one out of the park. It's a slow pitch for a batch of peace-loving social justice advocates like ourselves. But I am not Martin Luther King nor Mahatma Gandhi, so I feel a bit humbled before my subject. But language and its use is in my ballpark, so I'll turn my discussion to nonviolence by considering the ways that our language promotes through its metaphors notions of war and conflict. And then finally, I hope to suggest how we can arrive at peace. J. Edgar Hoover declared a war on crime in 1934. We fought a Cold War starting in 1950. Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty in 1964. After that came the war on cancer, the war on drugs, and of course there was the war on Christmas. And don't get me started on the war on women. Along the way, there have been some real wars. World War I and II, Korean War, Vietnam, and of course those fought in the Middle East. And perhaps we should not classify them as wars of defense, but another kind of war, a military intervention that will prop up a government we want to stay in power. Somewhere along the way, the idea of an actual defense got lost, as we haven't really been defending ourselves against anyone for a very long time, despite the vast amounts of money that go into our defense budget. We conscript soldiers, arm them, arm the armies of other countries, and some of our soldiers die and are wounded. We create heroes, enemies, build weapons, all a part of a vast industrial complex, military complex, that is funded to the tune of $725 billion a year. Our language reflects what seems to be that warrior culture. In general, metaphors allow us the simplification of ideas. By allowing broad comparisons, they can take ideas from a level that might be too complex to another more easily understood one. Parts of the metaphor, called in-themes, may be particularly relevant to the comparison and thus very useful, while those that don't translate, well, they tend to drop away. The speaker realizes that there are parts that don't quite work, yet the value of the construction outweighs the discrepancies that appear. Thus, physicians began to describe the myriad chemical bodily changes that come with cancer as an invasion that could be combated with a necessary regimen of drugs. Some had suggested that such terminology gave women a sense of agency, a power that did not make them just victims. Before long, the metaphor found its way into our colloquial language, so that it becomes nearly impossible to read about or discuss cancer without the metaphor of battle. And if that's what's needed for those in the battle, then I give support as needed. But even physicians have questioned their overuse of the simplified metaphor because with the body turned into a battleground, not every battle is won, and not everyone is a survivor. So carried to its unfortunate end, the metaphor can bring loss, defeat, and surrender. Susan Sontag, in her famous Disease as Metaphor, explained that when a disease is treated as an evil, a predator, a combatant, it demoralizes just when strength is most needed. Most recently, we had a war on COVID, and that, of course, gave us the war president. And having declared war, he was then enabled with all kinds of wartime powers, ones that even the military hesitated to put in the hands of someone who looked to be insane. These are the words of Donald Trump, and believe me, I wish I could do Trump's voice. I cannot. Pains me to read these sentences. You don't have to be much of a wordsmith to hear how these sound, but nonetheless. Every generation of Americans has been called to make shared sacrifices for the good of the nation. In World War II, young people in their teenage years volunteered to fight. They wanted to fight so badly because they love our country. Workers refused to go home and slept on factory floors to keep assembly lines running. And you know, the numbers of the ships they built during World War II, to this day, there has never been anything like it. They were doing ships on literally a daily basis. Nobody has ever seen anything like it. To this day, nobody has ever seen what they were able to do during World War II. And now it is our time. We must sacrifice together because we are all in this together and will come through this together. It's the invisible enemy. That's always the toughest enemy, the invisible one. But we are going to defeat the enemy. I think we are going to do this even faster than we thought, and it will be a complete victory. It will be a total victory. His war on the Chinese virus allowed him to enable the Defense Act. Trump conscripted healthcare workers and first responders into his war, but also expanded his forces to include delivery workers and food and grocery workers. They're all called brave and heroes again and again. Although it is rhetorically necessary for Trump's war to have the metaphorical soldiers to fight in it, the transformation of these civilian workers into soldiers creates challenges to the metaphor, not to mention ethical challenges overall. It requires the transformation of first responders and healthcare workers from civilians into military personnel. The militarization of the first responders, the police, the medics, and the firefighters, takes them from their community-based role in which they are to protect and serve, and changes the helping professions dramatically. Most healthcare workers seek to do no harm and to heal the sick. Making them over into warriors violates this orientation. This metaphorical incoherence shows what happened when parts of the metaphor that don't fit show themselves. I wonder too if it explains the particularly bellicose nature of the resistance to the virus, and most especially to the vaccines themselves. At some point, it seems our metaphors become truth. The words I read from Emerson in my opening remind us that it behooves us to be careful what we worship. for what we are worshiping, we are becoming. I conjecture whether the violent language and the metaphor of war has not in many ways carried over into masculinity itself. We all heard Trump in his chest thumping about the size of his nuclear buttons. Think too of those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. I discussed them earlier in a talk on performativity, wondering then, as I do now, how such a performance became nearly synonymous with a distorted notion of white masculinity. But as I said in my beginning, my audience is not one who needs to be convinced that less violence, real or metaphorical, would be a good thing. Has there ever been a time when we wished for a less combative culture? It gets tiring just to hear it. As Virginia Woolf said in regards to her efforts against World War I, she feels like a gnat on a blade of grass. There are ways to employ other metaphors, of course, rather than to say our strategy in a disagreement is to attack. We could say that we lay a foundation, or weave together our ideas, or that we have erased the doubts of the other side. Our logic can be not a weapon, but rather materials with which we construct our thinking, a template or a path that we like to follow. But we live in a culture so pervaded with the militarism that such switches in metaphor may take a little practice, as our habits of language are as difficult to change as any other. I played a little joke on myself in my title that I want to let you in on. If I had $1 for every student paper I've read that began something versus something else, I'd be a rich woman by now. You know what you're about to read is a ridiculously oversimplified comparison between things that are too nuanced to adequately be compared. So how do we move some examples of that are the Greek life versus the independent life, the romantics versus the realist, or, I kid you not, large bales of hay versus small ones. So how do we move from the examination of metaphors in language to something like peace? Deliberately, I think, and with deliberation. Virginia Woolf's strategies are from what might be called a feminine point of view. Have more parties, celebrate the continuity of life through social connections. Those of you who heard or were able to hear, literally, the tribute I gave to our beloved Sandy Morrison last year will know that I drew heavily on comparisons between Mrs. Dalloway and Sandy. Both of them took such joy in weaving people together through their social events. And here, let me also give a shout out to the ladies of the Alliance who've done so much to bring us Easter brunches and Christmas soup and so forth and so forth and so forth. I know we all look forward to the end of the pandemic so we can easily socialize and have more First Fridays, more coffee hours, and more carry-ins. Through these, we pay tribute to what Woolf called the human connection that shows values that are more important than any political idea. But by we, and by we, I mean each of you, each of us, has to decide how we can deliberately bring peace to our own minds. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Say amen, somebody? Amen. But is that a wish too foolish for us? As Unitarians, we are naturally drawn to reasoning, questioning, perhaps even a skeptical mindset, and thus it is difficult to surrender ourselves to what may seem an idealism that nears the pitiful. We all have an edge we come up to when a comfortable saying becomes a little too woo-woo, when reason and logic pull us back. Yet Bertolt Brecht said, Sometimes we have to choose between being human and having good taste. So, if there is a certain something in making a place of peace for yourself and allowing it and disregarding the judgment of others for whatever that might be, perhaps it is in an episode of the British baking show, or a walk in the woods, or perhaps it is in art or music, or perhaps it is in the simple act of breathing. It will probably surprise you to know that Steve and I took up yoga a while back. Slow and gentle, it's called, and it's largely meditative, so you can erase any images of either of us in a downward dog. We breathe. We suspend criticism and judgment of ourselves and others, and we breathe. Breathing, as it turns out, is one of my strong suits. It often surprises me to realize how often the practice of deep, slow breathing has become a habit that I now associate with the peace of yoga. I can't tell you how to find such a place of peace for yourselves, but I do think a deliberate choice in that direction becomes a habit. Put your gym shoes by the door so that you are reminded of a morning walk. Remember to take your pills when you brush your teeth in the morning. We come to our sanctuary on a Sunday to remind us of our spiritual selves, made stronger by the communion with other like souls, people we can trust, and I hope we take some of that solace away with us. So yes, let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with us. Thank you.